The arms race began in 1949 when the Soviet Union exploded an atomic bomb.
What was that?
It was a competition for supremacy in nuclear warfare between the United States, the Soviet Union, and their respective allies during the Cold War. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb. The world was shocked. They did not think the Soviet Union was this far along in their nuclear development. The arms race had begun.
The Berlin blockade or the Berlin airlift lasted until 1948 until 1949. Russians cut off access from the Allied zones on occupation in West Germany to West Berlin, which was in the Russian zones. The Allies had a choice to surrender West Berlin or supply by it. On June 24, 1948, Soviet forces blockaded all road, rail, and water routes into Berlin's Allied-controlled areas, stifling the vital flow of food, coal, and other supplies. But the Soviets couldn't block Allied airspace, so U.S. and UK forces took to the skies to get supplies to the Allied sectors, the event we know as the Berlin airlift.
On January 1, 1959, a young Cuban nationalist named Fidel Castro drove his army into Havana and overthrew General Fulgencio Batista. Bay of Pigs invasion failed because Cuban air forces as well as aid from USA was able to stop the attacks once they had landed on the beach. On April 17, 1961, 1,400 Cuban exiles launched what began a botched invasion at the Bay of Pigs on the south coast of Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro came to power in an armed revolt that overthrew Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista.
The wall was a guarded concrete barrier that physically and ideologically divided Berlin from 1961 to 1989. It was 11 feet and 81 inches. The Berlin Wall was a barrier that surrounded West Berlin and prevented access to it from East Berlin and adjacent areas of East Germany during the period from 1961 to 1989. In the years between 1949 and 1961, about 2.5 million East Germans have fled from East to West Germany, including steadily rising numbers of skilled workers, professionals, and intellectuals. Their loss threatened to destroy the economic viability of East German states. In response, East Germany built a barrier to close off East Germans' access to West Berlin and hence West Germany.
Next was the Cuban Missiles Crisis. During the Cuban Missiles Crisis, leaders of the U.S. and the Soviet Union engaged in a tense 13-day political and military standoff in October 1962 over the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles away from the U.S. shores. In a TV address on October 27, 1962, President John Kennedy notified Americans about the presence of the missiles, explained his decisions to enact a naval blockade around Cuba, and made it clear the U.S. was prepared to use military force, if necessary, to neutralize the preserved threat to national security. Following this news, many people feared the world was on the brink of nuclear war. However, disaster was avoided from when the U.S. agreed to the Soviet leader. U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. Kennedy also secretly agreed to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey.
The domino theory was a policy that stated a communist government in one nation would quickly lead to a communist takeover in neighboring states. In Southeast Asia, the U.S. government used the now discredited domino theory to justify its involvement in the Vietnam War and its support for a non-communist dictator in South Vietnam. By 1950, makers of U.S. foreign policy had firmly embraced the idea that the fall of Indochina's communism would lead rapidly to the collapse of other nations in Southeast Asia. The domino theory is now largely discredited, having failed to take into account the character of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong struggle in the Vietnam War.
The fall of the Soviet Union happened in the December of 1991 as the world watched in amazement. The Soviet Union disintegrated into 15 separate countries. Its collapse was hailed by the West as a victory for freedom, a triumph of democracy over totalitarianism, and evidence of the superiority over capitalism over socialism. On Christmas Day, 1991, the Soviet flag flew over the Kremlin in Moscow for the last time. Representatives from Soviet republics had already announced that they would no longer be part of the Soviet Union. Instead, they declared they would establish a Commonwealth of independent states.
Thanks for watching!